Today is the 105th anniversary of the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, an iconic moment in the history of the Great War, and in many ways an iconic moment in the history of the 20th century. I've used this quote from A.J.P. Taylor before. He said that for him, the first day of the Battle of the Somme was the true moment the 20th century began, not on the 1st of January 1900, but on the 1st of July 1916. And what he meant by that was this was a day not of victories, but of disaster, when more than 57,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers became casualties in a single day, and that this day would herald a new type of warfare, total war, industrial war, with killing on an industrial scale, which would characterise much of the rest of the 20th century. And today many of us will be thinking of that moment in time, on that beautiful summer's morning when thousands of British soldiers went over the top, and we'll be pondering on our own journeys across that Somme landscape, and perhaps thinking of soldiers we've researched or ancestors that we lost that day. But first, what of the background to the 1st of July 1916, that first day of the Somme? How did it happen? At the end of 1915, there was a new Commander-in-Chief of the British forces on the Western Front, Douglas Haig. He'd taken over from Sir John French after the failed Battle of Loos in 1915, and Haig met with his French counterparts of the French General Staff to discuss forthcoming offensives. The French were always keen on throwing the Germans out of France. They weren't too bothered by Belgium, which for Britain was our main theatre of operations. Haig had in mind a plan to attack along the Messines Ridge, and here used tunnellers of the Royal Engineers to dig underneath the German positions along the ridge and destroy them. This would of course become the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. But the French were keen on the idea of an Anglo-French offensive, and the ground of their choosing was the Somme, because at the same moment Britain was extending their line across the Western Front, taking over more sectors, Arras, the northern part of the Somme, and then right down to the area close to the river where the French army was. So if there was to be an Anglo-French offensive, this was the ideal place where British units joined with the French on this part of the Western Front. That was the plan, to take place sometime in June of 1916. But the Battle of Verdun got in the way. Now, the events of Verdun, which we have mentioned on the podcast before, don't really concern us today. But what it did do, of course, was take away French units that had hitherto been allocated to take part in the Battle of the Somme. This meant that pretty rapidly the Somme became much more of a British affair than a French one, although French troops did participate quite successfully on the southern end of the front at the beginning of the battle. But for Britain, this iconic moment in the Great War was the point in which the new armies, having first been used at the Battle of Loos in 1915, were coming together amongst their regular and territorial counterparts in much greater numbers. This was the moment in which those men of Kitchener's army recruited in 1914, the sort of men that we probably think of every time we think of the Great War, the eager volunteers who had joined Chums or Pals battalions from right across Britain, in particular in the industrial north. Local to me here, of course, the Barnsley Pals, and just up the road the Sheffield City Battalion. These were the faces, really, of Kitchener's army, the men who'd responded to that call for 100,000 volunteers, and by the end of 1914 Kitchener had got 1 million. And now in the summer of 1916, for them, all roads led to the Somme. This was a massive offensive. The battles of 1915 had been plagued by lack of artillery, a shortage of shells, lots of problems with coordination and communications. It seemed here as if all of that was coming together, and as the men came down to the Somme, they saw these vast stockpiles of ammunition and equipment ready for the offensive. In the end, 7 days' bombardment lobbed 1.75 million shells at the German trenches from Gommecourt in the north to Montauban in the south. If you'd been a British Tommy there in 1916 on the eve of this great battle and been told that we're going to throw nearly 2 million shells at the Germans and that nothing will survive. And this is a phrase that was used at the time: nothing will survive, not even a rat, and all you're going to have to simply do is to walk across no man's land. Then I think that you would have believed it, and I think everyone did believe it, from private to general. That amount of artillery, that amount of shelling, surely nothing could survive. But the Somme, like Sussex, where I grew up, is rolling chalk downland, and the Germans who'd prepared their positions here in 1914 had dug deep. They had deep dugouts in the chalk, many of them 20, 30, 40 feet beneath the surface, some even more than that. And the bulk of those 1 3/4 million shells that were fired at the Germans were the standard field artillery rounds, the 18-pounder rounds, and many of them were shrapnel to cut the wire, and it meant that the Germans could just simply shelter in these deep dugouts from the Trommelfeuer, as they called it, the drum fire, and just wait for the bombardment to lift. And that bombardment lifted at 7:30 a.m. on that fateful morning of the 1st of July 1916. On the British side of no man's land, the men began to prepare, mount the scaling ladders to get up onto the parapet to move into no man's land. In certain areas, white tape had been laid to show them where to stand, to await the orders of officers to move forward. On the German side, they were emerging from their dugouts after 7 days' confinement, with weapons in hand, machine guns at the ready, setting up their weapons to lay down devastating fire into anybody who would come near their positions. Their trenches were damaged by the bombardment, but the defenders were intact. That's the important aspect of understanding what happened on the 1st of July 1916, in that it doesn't matter what you do to the trenches, it doesn't matter what you do to the shelters. If the people inside, if the defenders have survived, they will come up, set up their weapons, and the killing will begin. And that's exactly what happened. On that perfect summer's morning, with absolutely perfect visibility for us, but of course for the defenders as well, the men of Kitchener's army, the volunteers, the territorials who fought in the battle, the last vestiges of the British regular army who were there, went up, out into no man's land, into the waist-high grass that separated that ground between their trenches and the German positions, and moved off into what can only be described as machine gun oblivion. The guns began to play. In most cases in the Great War, most men were killed or wounded by shell fire, but on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the German machine guns, so well sighted, just laid into the lines of men that were walking across no man's land. That sunlit picture of hell, as Siegfried Sassoon described it, is exactly what the 1st of July was. In most cases, these men moved only tens of yards from their jumping off positions. They had no chance of crossing the strip of no man's land with that amount of machine gun fire, and then artillery fire as the Germans reacted to the attack came dropping down onto no man's land as well, taking out even further men. The attacks melted away. In most areas, battalion after battalion went forward, and battalion after battalion was cut down in no man's land. In some cases, an entry into the German positions had been effected, but in such small numbers that they were quickly overwhelmed, and on most parts of the front that day there was nothing to show for the casualties that had ensued. In most cases the Germans remained in their positions, and it was only to the south between Mametz and Montauban that any great success had been achieved. There most of the objectives had been taken. But how could there be success there and not elsewhere? When you look at that part of the battlefield, the use of heavy artillery had been much more effective, and this became a key lesson. Bigger guns and more bigger guns would be required to destroy German positions. You needed to entomb German defenders in their dugouts, smash their machine gun positions to oblivion, and keep them in those trenches until you made your attack, not fire at them, and then the barrage would be lifted, and it would give the Germans that fatal moment to come up out of their positions and mow your men down in no man's land. And by the end of that day, nearly 20,000 British soldiers had been killed, in total 57,000 British and Commonwealth casualties. This was the blackest day in the history of the British Army. More men became casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme than in the entire Crimean War, for example. So this was Britain's bloodiest day. And while the Newfoundland Regiment took part in that attack at the time, this was a British colony, and the Newfoundland Regiment was part of the British Army. Although today that is a Canadian battlefield site on the Somme, they didn't see themselves as Canadians in 1916. But for them and the 10th Battalion, the West Yorkshire Regiment, who together had the highest single battalion casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, there was nothing to show for their sacrifice. And this was true for so many of the parts of the front that day. Despite those 57,000 casualties, the Battle of the Somme continued. In that southern area, the success was exploited, and gradually the battle moved on. Was the Somme a success? Was it a victory or defeat? Over 100 years later, historians are still arguing over that fact. And when you look at its original intent to become a breakout battle, and then to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, it certainly did that, because with the attack on the Somme on the 1st of July, just over a week later the Germans made their final assault at Verdun. For them it was impossible to maintain an offensive battle at Verdun and a defensive battle on the Somme simultaneously. But whether that was worth the sacrifice of so many men is something that I'm sure will occupy historians for millennia to come. So that's a little bit of background to the 1st of July. We'll now head over to the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing that commemorates those who fell on the Somme who have no known grave, and think about the casualties of the 1st of July there. The village of Thiepval, or Thiepval as the British troops called it, is where the memorial to the missing is now sited. Thiepval, mighty Thiepval, dominates the landscape here on the Somme. There are very few parts of the Somme where you can't at least see the very top of it. And there it is, sitting majestically on this ridge, overlooking the grounds where the Battle of the Somme began, sited not, as many think, on top of the ruins of the old Thiepval Chateau, that was closer to the village, but it is certainly close to the German positions that were part of their frontline defences on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. When the scrub around the memorial was cleared in the lead up to the Great War centenary, the remains of those German trenches were visible, and they still are in the rough bit of grass that leads up to the Thiepval Ultui road that you can see from the cemetery. The memorial was designed by Edwin Lutyens, one of the principal architects of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or Imperial War Graves Commission as it was then, and we will return to Thiepval to look at it properly in depth in another podcast episode. Originally it commemorated more than 72,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who had no known grave, and its purpose was to remember those who by the fortunes of war did not have a marked burial site. This was a great problem on all battlefields of the Great War, where nearly 50% of the dead did not have a marked grave, did not have a known grave, were missing. In some cases they were buried as unknown soldiers. In many cases they'd become part of the battlefield and would be lost forevermore. In previous wars, the families of these men would have had nothing to see, no grave marker, no place to mourn. But as this conflict had touched almost every family in the land, the Commission felt that it would be unfair for these families to have nothing to see. So the memorials to the missing were the answer to this, with huge panels that would list by name the men from different regiments who had fallen and had no known grave. Now when we visit Thiepval today, there's no dates against any of the names on this memorial. You'll have to look them up to see when they died and the details about them. But using the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's database, we can ascertain that 12,413 of the names on this memorial are men who died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916. Now, if around 19,000 died that day, most of them, 12,413 of them, do not have a known grave. And that tells us a lot about the outcome of the attacks that day, because this was ground that was eventually taken in many cases, sometimes not until 1917. But what it also meant, and what this hints at, is that the bodies of these men who had moved forward on that summer's morning out into the grass in no man's land to attack the German positions, when they fell, they lay there for many weeks, many months, and often into the following spring. And that meant that the recovery and the burial and the identification of these casualties, when that was possible, was made very difficult indeed. And men may well have had their dog tag, their pay book, and other papers taken off the body at the point in which they had died, or perhaps later when men had got out into no man's land in the darkness to do this, but the body could not be buried, and when it was eventually found and reburied later, there was nothing on it to say who it was, and so many were subsequently buried in cemeteries on the Somme front as unknowns. So perhaps it's not surprising when we discover that of those 19,000 dead, 12,500 of them nearly do not have a known grave and are commemorated here on the Thiepval Memorial. Now, some men died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, but their date of death is not recorded as such. In many units they rounded off the dead because they weren't sure when these men had actually died. And in quite a lot of battalions, particularly some of the POWs ones at Serre, they recorded men who had actually died on the first day as having been killed in action on the 2nd of July. And when we look at the Commission's database, we see that there's a further 563 men who died on the 2nd of July 1916. Now, some of those will have been killed that day in operations to the south and in some smaller operations, particularly around Thiepval and Thiepval Wood and the Schwaben Redoubt area, but a high proportion probably of that number are men who actually died on the first day. So then we're getting to nearer 13,000 men commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial who actually died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The Commission's database records that 18,618 men are commemorated in France who died on the 1st of July 1916. So if we take away the figure of the men commemorated here at Thiepval on the panels of the memorial, that means that 6,205 are commemorated with headstones, are buried in cemeteries here on the Somme battlefields. So only a proportion, only 1 in 3 of the men who died that day have a marked grave. And again, this is perhaps the agony, the extended tragedy of the 1st of July, is that there were so many men killed that day who were posted as missing, no witnesses to their death, no indication of how they died, exactly where they died, whether in no man's land or in the German trenches, and even if they'd died. And that meant that families kept hope. They hoped beyond hope that somehow these men had survived, lost their memories and were prisoners of war, would suddenly miraculously turn up. But the reality was they'd been killed that fateful day and they would never be coming home. But these figures are mind-boggling really, so let's personalise it a bit. When we look at the figures in the Commission's database of that nearly 12,500 men commemorated here on the Thiepval Memorial who were killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme and have no known grave, the youngest were 15 years old, 2 15-year-olds, Private Henry Woodward of the 1st 6 Royal Warwicks, who was killed at Serre in the attack on the Heidenkopf. He was from West Kensington. Private John Quigley of the 10th Battalion Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. He was from County Londonderry and was killed in the Ulster Division's assault near Thiepval. In addition to those 2 15-year-olds, there are 6 16-year-olds recorded and an incredible 70 17-year-olds. Now, bearing in mind that the minimum age for enlistment was 18, then these were all teenage Tommies who had lied about their age at the beginning of the war and had got in. I often describe the veteran that I interviewed back in the 80s who joined up as an underage soldier. He went into the recruiting office. The sergeant major at the table said, "How old are you, sonny?" 16, sir. He said, "Well, go outside and march round the block and come back when you're 18. As long as you said you were that age and you looked that age, you were in." And thousands of these young men, as Richard Van Emden, who we had on the podcast, is discovering more and more of their details, hopefully for a new edition of his book Teenage Tommy soon. Now, of course, these men, we know their age because their families submitted those details with the final verification form that they received after the war. Every family was sent one of these, not everybody returned them. So there are many thousands of names on the Thiepval Memorial for which no age is recorded. So there could be some even younger soldiers and ones of that young age that we don't know about. At the other end of the scale, old soldiers. The two oldest soldiers on the memorial who died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, with their age recorded, were 54, both of them 54, both of them in the same battalion, the 9th Battalion, the York and Lancs, and they were killed at the Nab in between Thiepval and Overlers on the 1st of July. One was Major Harry Lewis, he was from Hertford, and the other was Company Sergeant Major Joseph Webster, and he was from Sheffield. So from 15 to 54, this gives us, not an unreasonable age bracket of the sort of men that took part in that fateful 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. When we look at ranks, there's every rank from private to lieutenant colonel who were killed on the first day. 6 lieutenant colonels killed commanding their battalions, taking them into action, were killed on the 1st of July and are commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial. There's a number of majors on here as well who were actually acting lieutenant colonels commanding battalions. So that number of battalion commanders with no known grave is much higher than just the 6 lieutenant colonels that we mention. There are nearly 300 second lieutenants who were killed on the 1st of July. Now these were platoon commanders, subalterns, young men leading their platoon forward, very often in their first battle. This wasn't a case of them saying to their men, "Okay, chaps, the enemy trenches are over there, off you go." It was a case of, "Okay, chaps, follow me," and leading their men out into no man's land. As the machine guns began to fire, they were often the first to fall. And 300 of them commemorated here with no known grave. The largest number of names against particular regiments are with the Northumberland Fusiliers and the Manchester Regiment, both of whom fielded a large number of battalions, particularly POWs battalions, in areas like La Boisselle, where the Tyneside Irish and the Tyneside Scottish took part in the attack there, or down at Mametz and Montauban, where the Manchester City battalions took part in 2 different divisions in the assault on those villages on the southern end of the Somme front. And in terms of decorations of the men who died on the 1st of July 1916 and are commemorated here at Thiepval, 3 of them were awarded the Victoria Cross. One of those was Billy McFadgen of the Belfast Young Citizens Battalion, who was probably the first recipient of the VC that day. When the hand grenades were being brought up in their boxes for the assault to be dished out to the troops, a box was dropped, the pins popped out, the grenades were now active, and McFadgen threw himself onto it to absorb the explosion and save the lives of the men around him. And for his bravery that day, he was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. In addition, there were 22 Distinguished Conduct Medal recipients on the memorial, 114 men who had been awarded the Military Medal, and amongst the officers, 21 men who had been awarded the Military Cross. But for the bravery of soldiers that day, many, many more awards were given out to men who survived. And of course, when we stand here in front of the mighty archways of the Thiepval Memorial, it is the dead that we're focusing on. But most men came back. The Somme, the first day of the Somme, resulted in all those terrible casualties. But men eventually came home with the memories of the bravery they'd seen that day and the terrible sacrifice of those they'd gone into battle with and who would never return. So many of the veterans that I interviewed back in the 80s and 90s recalled often with tears the men who were listed on monuments like this one. And with that, we'll move on to the next subject we'll look at for this special podcast for the 105th anniversary, and that's what the Somme, the first day of the Somme, means to me. So what does the first day of the Battle of the Somme mean to me? Or perhaps, if I phrase that better, what do I think of on a day like this? I've spent so many 1st of Julys on the Somme at different locations, remembering different parts of the front. I try to do something different every year, really. But today I will be thinking of so many of the veterans that I knew and the stories of men who fell. Eric Heaton, who we had discussed in this podcast before, a young second lieutenant in the 16th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, who was killed on the first day of the Somme, aged only 20. He'd written an incredible letter to his father the night before the battle in Ocean Villas. One of those letters that if he died was to be passed to his family, and of course it was. And in that he talks about how he came out willingly to serve his king and country, and urges his family that if I fall, do not let things be black for you. Be cheerful, and you will be living always to my memory. He was killed in the grass somewhere near the Hawthorne crater, trying to take his platoon up to their objective. His body lay out on the battlefield for the rest of the Battle of the Somme until it was recovered during the winter of 1916-17, and the family back home, his father, a parish priest in Hove in Sussex, had to finally accept that Eric was never returning. And all those decades later, I would find his sister still living in Hove, and the story for me of Eric and his death on the first day of the Battle of the Somme would be something that would stay with me always. The family visited Eric's grave just after the war in 1919 and placed a plaque on the wooden cross that was there then, which is still there to this day. A nice continuation, really, of remembrance from that post-war period, from one family, that still inspires us to visit those places today. But it's the veterans I think of too. Horace Ham, close to the Hawthorne crater, where Eric Heaton was killed. He was in the same battalion as Eric in the 16th Middlesex, and assembling at the White City to get ready to make their attack, a German shrapnel shell exploded in the air above, and Horace was wounded in the ankle. He was the first man in the aid post, the first man at the dressing station, the first man at the casualty clearing station. That minor injury, really, was serious enough to get him back home to Blighty, and it saved his life, because the comrades that he'd assembled with there that morning, very few of those came back from the Hawthorne Ridge attack at Beaumont Hamel. Aubrey Rose, up at Gomercourt, I think of him. Young Jewish lad in the Queen's Westminster Rifles. He'd gone into action as a runner to his company commander, Captain Mott. Mott had been killed in front of him, and as Aubrey was coming back across no man's land with a message, the shock of seeing his officer killed made him drop to his knees and cry. And as he got back to the British trenches with his message and handed it over to an officer, quite prepared to return to the shattered survivors of his battalion still fighting in the German trenches, he was told to stay there, make his way up the communication trench and go back to the village of Hebuterne. And as he was doing so, a German shell exploded above him and he was riddled with shrapnel balls, and that brought his war to an end. And Harry Coates, not far away from him, who I've mentioned in this podcast before, in the dugout opposite Gomercourt with the Brigadier and Philip Neame VC, watching the men of their brigade go into action and so few come back. Harry and the brigade major, Neame, having to escort the Brigadier in with shell shock from his dugout. But perhaps most of all, I'll be thinking of Reg Glenn from Sheffield, a member of the Sheffield City Battalion, the 12th Battalion New York and Lancs, who was a signaller who went over the top in the attack on Serre on the morning of the 1st of July, and saw the battalion of men who he'd grown up with, some of whom he'd gone to school with, disappear into the grass. The battalion, the city of Sheffield, somehow never to be the same again. Reg and the survivors hung on in those trenches at Serre for much of the rest of the battle. They had a stint up near Richbourg for a while, but returned for the end of the offensive. The Hull POWs made their attack there in November, and Serre still did not fall to the British. Until the Germans retreated to the Hindenburg line the following spring, it was impossible to recover the dead. Reg recounted how they would look through the trench periscopes and see the bodies of men in no man's land and men hanging on the wire, and knew that they would only risk their own deaths by trying to recover them. But recover them eventually they did. By this time, Reg was the Padre's friend. He'd played the piano before the war, and he'd volunteered to play the Padre's trench organ, and he accompanied him everywhere. and as the Germans pulled back to the Hindenburg Line and the British Army finally advanced into Serre, the Padre went forward to go and bury the dead, and Reg stood there amongst the shattered remains of the men he'd known, and gradually they were buried in the cemeteries that we know today: Luke Copse, Queen's Cemetery at Poisieux, and Serre Road number 3. And Reg said two things really about the tragic outcome of the first day of the Somme and the experience that he'd had that day. One of them was that after that he never feared death, because standing there with the Padre and seeing the rats amongst the skeletons of the men of the Sheffield POWs and the Barnsley POWs and the Hull POWs who died at the end of the battle, he never feared death because he'd seen hell. He'd visualised hell. The thing that he said, and indeed so many men that I interviewed who took part in the first day of the Battle of the Somme said, the thing that he remembered most of all was that moment, that fleeting moment, when the barrage lifted, and for a while, a short while, there was a moment of quiet. But in that quiet, above them, were the skylarks. And today, that sound of the skylarks will be with me, will be the thing that, just like Reg, who said whenever he heard them again, it transported him back to the Somme. And I hope it transports you too, back to the Somme, back to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.